On the face of it, a hospital is meant to accomplish something rather simple and straightforward. A patient with a condition visits a doctor, and the two of them together decide the best way to remedy the condition. Everything lies at the heart of this atomic interaction between the patient and the physician. However, it can be quite amusing to notice how this simple one-to-one has gotten so complicated. There are so many different stakeholders in a hospital system, and each one of them with divergent agendas and divergent goals. The slide here attempts to depict all the different stakeholder, quote unquote, Avenger forces that heavily influence the shape, the nature, and sometimes even the result of the interaction between the patient and the physician. Let us broadly examine the priorities of each of these stakeholders and the individual forces they exert on the hospital ecosystem. Patients. They desire optimal therapy, they want the best clinical outcomes and the lowest possible costs. Physicians, they also desire optimal therapy, they also want the best outcomes for their patients, but they also desire appropriate compensation, remuneration, and adequate safety. Organization, the promoters, the investors, they obviously want positive returns on their investments. They want a strategy that de-risks and provides them with credibility and good reputation. Insurance companies desire lower reimbursements and higher coverage. Pharmaceutical companies have research-related motives and sometimes, of course, profit incentive. Governments desire regulation. They want to secure supply, access, and high levels of cost effectiveness. A hospital lies at the crossroads of these divergent interest groups and the competing forces each of these groups exert. A fertile ground indeed for conflicts to fester. The relative bargaining power of each of the stakeholders and the application of limited financial resources available to a hospital determine what I call the resultant hospital organizational design. If not carefully calibrated, the relative power of these forces could lead to hospitals, which are already complex by design, becoming very dangerous places. For example, it is not difficult to imagine a hospital in your town that may wax eloquent on being patient-centric, but you know that it is probably just mere lip service. As an example, here is the organizational design of a hospital that is applying its limited financial resources dependent on the various forces that are exerted by the different stakeholders. And as you can see here, this particular hospital has invested heavily into ensuring the protection of its promoters' investments and also on technology, but has inadequately compensated for meeting physician expectations and also patient expectations, thereby creating a design that seems a bit lopsided. As you can see, the impact of our decisions can completely overlook patient and physician expectations if we don't adequately examine the conflicts and develop good compromises. Another visible shift that has most doctors fuming is the transition from paternalism to consumerism. Medicine has faced criticism, and I think understandably, for its history of paternalism, where Papa Doctor imposed his view on the child patient, who was expected to comply without a murmur. The balance of power, though, is shifting from the paternalistic physician to the consumerist patient. This change is largely driven by the increased availability of clinical information on the internet. Papa Doctor obviously is not amused. As technology matures, patients or healthcare consumers now, as they call themselves, will exert reverse pressure. Doctors will not be able to resist technologies like ChatGPT, Grok, and scores of other AI models in medicine that will become pervasive within the decade. Consumerism and democratization of healthcare will be a reality. It is a matter of when and not if. How this unfolds and affects the relationship dynamics will be a fascinating study. Another emerging cartel is the insurance companies. As insurance coverage increases worldwide, their power can be significant because remember, they will control both patient flow and payment. That might very well be a new form of paternalism that is largely invisible, both to the patient and to the doctor. It will most likely diminish the autonomy of the doctor, hospitals, and probably even the patient. As it seems to me now, there is a trust deficit between the citizens and the hospital system, especially when it comes to pricing. And insurance companies could very well use this gap to shift the landscape in their favor. I almost forgot to mention the power of regulators, courts, and the influence of citizen action groups and their implications for doctors and hospitals. Especially if hospitals don't start looking closely at their pricing or providing some level of price transparency, a topic which we will discover and examine very closely later on in this series, I can visualize governments and even top courts seizing the matter suo motu and muddying the waters for large private corporate hospitals, especially in emerging markets like India. In conclusion, hospitals are incredibly complex systems, probably amongst the most complex organization structures that we know of. When we think complex, we tend to think of organizations like the NASA or ISRO. However, hospitals, in my humble opinion, can be equally, if not more complex. I know this sounds a tad exaggerated, but not many industries or organizational structures are as complex and unpredictable for some of the reasons that I've been outlining as hospitals. It is intrinsic and built into the design and fabric of a hospital. The earlier slides and the arguments so far that I've made is really for acknowledging that hospitals are complex beasts. The issue is that, or the problem that I face is that many stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem seem to be generally blind to this fact or don't take this as seriously. Even if there is some acknowledgement, I suspect it is not adequately or uniformly shared by all stakeholders. And this causes severe loss of alignment, and the consequences are manifold. However, if healthcare is uniformly viewed as complex rather than as a mechanical system or like any other business, then several of its intrinsic properties can be exploited to influence the dynamic behavior and guide the hospital in a favorable direction. These properties include nonlinear interactions of component parts, emergent self-organized behavior, and the dependence on simple rules. Let's remember that complex systems have fuzzy boundaries. The interacting agents operate on the basis of internal rules that cannot always be predicted, and they adapt, interact, and co-evolve with other systems. Crucially, complexity is a feature of the system, not a characteristic of the intervention. Because of all of this, hospitals can also be utterly dangerous. We've just seen how complex and hybrid they are. And let me now share some studies that argue how dangerous a hospital can be unambiguously. But before that, here's a question for you to reflect and contemplate upon.